A lot of people, they understand inherently now the danger of organizations getting too big and too powerful, because ultimately that organization that controls how a billion people think is run by one person with 4 people advising them at the top. And so is it really wise for 4 people or one person to decide what a billion people can think and say and do, and how far apart they should sit, or whether or not they should smile, or what they should wear? So I think the entire crypto movement is a backlash against that. Last I checked, there are north of 400 million people that have some crypto involvement, that have embraced it. Hundreds of millions of Bitcoin holders. And I think what people are realizing is that you can use the power of cryptography to give people back their voice, to give them back their property rights, to give them back their sovereignty, also to give them back ownership of their own data.
You are losing half of your entire wealth every 10 years, but there is a solution. That's the message out from Michael Saylor. Michael Saylor is not just a billionaire and engineer who studied at MIT. He's also a student of history and has spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours going over the history of civilization. His conclusion: one thing is inevitable: corruption, taxation, and the creation of monopolies. Michael Saylor views inflation under the same lens. Inflation, due to money printing by the government, is a form of taxation, a way to further tax citizens indirectly. However, for the first time in history, there's a solution. Bitcoin is the first time it's possible to stop the cycle of monopolies, corruption, and taxation. That's why Michael Saylor has 100% conviction in Bitcoin and believes it's going to 1000x over time. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where Saylor breaks down every single asset class and why it's inferior to holding your wealth in Bitcoin. Also guys, only a small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed. If you enjoy finance content, consider subscribing or liking the video. It's free and you can always change your mind.
If you study the history of the world, and you could pick any history, but I'll take the history of the United States. Read Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty. It's the story of every colony in the United States before the Revolutionary War. And it goes something like this. Some people showed up because they were being murdered and they were being looted by someone in Europe. They got to the US, they established their own property rights so they could have land, and then immediately some governor took over the colony and started regulating, stealing, and taxing and looting their property. So then they moved west or moved south, or then they toppled that governor. And over again, everywhere, the story is always the same. Somebody shows up, they want to find some property, they want to create a farm, they want to create a company, they start growing wheat, and then the governor decides to create a monopoly on baking of bread, and then the governor says it's illegal to bake bread with your wheat, you have to sell my bakery your wheat at a lower price. And then that governor, or the governor's family that he or she married into, they have a mop on bread, they triple the price of bread, everybody else has to pay too much for the bread, someone complains, the government send some soldiers to kick their door in. The people may or may not fight back. The story goes on. Then, a politician passes another law. You can't print books. You can't make hats. You can't cross from this side of the river to that side of the river. Whatever it is, you can't go up the Hudson River without paying a fee to me. It's always corruption, always monopoly, always taxation. There is no end to it. There never has been an end to it. There never will be an end to it as long as we are physical creatures and we live in the physical domain. So what is the appeal of Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is the digital transformation of property, the digital transformation of money, leading to the digital transformation of energy and matter, and then eventually the digital transformation of identity. If you can manifest something with substance in cyberspace, and if that something is protected with a private key, whether that something is your company, your property, your money, or your identity, you now have sovereignty in the form of the secret inside your head. And when it comes time for my country to steal all your stuff, if your wealth is in my bank or in national banks in the form of the national currency, I can simply double the currency supply and steal half of everybody's property overnight without even admitting I did it, right? You just have 100% inflation. It's happening in Argentina right now. It's happening lots of places in the world. So you've always got that option. And if you have assets in the form of a foreign currency or a security and they're with a centralized custodian, I just send a message to the custodian saying, convert all that back into the local currency, devalue it 10 to 1. And I've just done the same thing. I've done it overnight. If your property is in the form of land, I just put a property tax on it. You're not moving the land. If your property is in the form of a company, I just make it, maybe I put an excise tax or a value added tax or some other tax on the thing that you want to sell, and that's how I take it. But if your property is digital property, and if you either have the option to put it with a custodian outside of your country, right? The beauty of, if you had $1 million building in a country in South America, it's not moving, but you could move $1 million of Bitcoin to hundreds of custodians in any country on earth, and you can move it every day. So you can kind of always, if Switzerland is the place you can trust, you move it there, and then a few years later, you can move it to London. A few years later, if you lose faith in the UK, you move it to the US, or you move it to Singapore, or you move it to UAE. Eventually, you put it on some big container ship floating in the middle of the Atlantic with a satellite uplink, right? You have a chance if you have a portable asset, and ultimately you have the option, just take self-custody and hold it yourself or put it in your head. Those are not options you have when you live in the physical domain. So when I say Bitcoin represents a separation of property and earth, what I'm really getting at is there's maybe $950 trillion of wealth in this world, and 350 trillion of it is real estate. Half of it is liquid capital or wealth. People would like to move around. So 500 trillion, right? Bitcoin's only 400 billion. So we're talking about 1,000x that amount of wealth. 1,000x as much is trapped. It's trapped in the earth. When you own a company, when you own a building, when you own land, when you own a bar of gold, it's in the physical domain, which means you own it at the pleasure of a counterparty, a custodian, and a politician. And in fact, unfortunately, it's like there's 100 people in the world that can take it away from you. And as long as all 100 decide not to take it away from you this year, you get to keep it for one more year. That is the counterparty risk of everything else. When you dematerialize that property, when you digitally transform it from land or a building or a company and you put it into cyberspace, you have escaped the counterparty risk from 100 different counterparties. People you don't even know. Like, there are people that started yoga studios in 2018 and they didn't know that one health official, maybe a health official in a state, would just decide to shut down their business and destroy their livelihood for whatever reason, right? Someone you may never have heard of that was not elected may just decide whether or not your property has any value. And that, unfortunately, is not a new story. It's been going on for 10,000 years. And you could write 10 million pages of histories of some innocent person that had their life and livelihood and liberty and pursuit of happiness wrecked by someone more powerful than them. Until Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's the first time where there's something that comes along where you might actually own something yourself that is beyond the reach of those that would do you harm, economically or otherwise. And that's a pretty profound idea, which is what kind of keeps us all motivated. I never thought about what money was until the COVID lockdowns, and then Federal Reserve lowered the interest rate to zero. And I had a lot of money in the bank generating zero. And then it occurred to me that the prices were going to go up quite a lot. And I started thinking about a couple of concepts. One is, what is money? And the second is, what is inflation? And then the third is, what is wealth and how do you preserve wealth? Well, a simple answer to what is money is economic energy. Money is, you have a certain amount of wealth, and economic energy could be viewed as capital, could be viewed as wealth. And we oftentimes store our economic energy in different assets. We could store it in a currency like the dollar. We could store it in a bar of gold. We could store it in diamonds. We could store it in a Ferrari. We could store it in a house, in a building, in a warehouse, or we could buy a share of stock. These are all different ways to store our wealth, our economic energy. And they all serve as sort of money. Now the question is, which of those assets is the best money? I think the thing to keep there in mind there is if money is energy, the energy dissipates with a certain time frame. So for example, if you had $100,000 in the year 1930, you could have bought a very, very nice house in Miami Beach. I know because I own a house built in 1930, and the deed of sale is for $100,000 on 2 acres in the middle of Miami Beach. That house was appraised at $46 million in about 90 years later, okay? So if you actually are good at math, you can calculate that what that means is approximately a 99.8% loss in the purchasing power of the dollar over 90 years. Or if you do exponential math in your head, I can tell you the answer. It's 7% inflation rate. The inflation rate of real estate in Miami Beach over the last century is 7% a year. Now, the politicians and the government agencies will tell you that inflation target is only 2%, or they'll tell you CPI is 2%. But in fact, the inflation rate of consumer goods that are manufactured, like, like cardboard boxes of milk, or cardboard boxes of water, or drywall, or Netflix videos, or biscuits coming out of an assembly line, or chocolate bars that come out, $1 million an hour. Yeah, those things are going up in price, but they're not going up at 7% a year because technology and capital investment and human ingenuity is actually making it cheaper, right? You can reasonably conclude that we're better at manufacturing things today than 100 years ago. So, of course, things that are manufactured get a little bit cheaper. But what can't you manufacture more of? And that's like beachfront property in Miami. Okay, so if you actually calculate the inflation rate of scarce desirable assets like beachfront property, it isn't 2%, it's 7 or 8%. The same is true of real estate in London, Paris, LA, any place desirable. It turns out the inflation rate of the S&P index of a scarce desirable company, one of the 500 best run companies in the United States, that's also 7%. The government would tell you that's not inflation, that's just that's asset appreciation. They'll say, good for you. Homeowners' values of their homes went up 7% this year, and the value of your stock went up by 7% this year. But what they're missing is that the average person's salary isn't going up by 7%. So it gets harder and harder and harder for people to buy scarce, desirable things. I think once I got into this business, I realized that the dollar is not a good monetary instrument because it loses 7% of its purchasing power a year. But foreign currencies, like the peso or the lira or something, they lose 14% or more of their purchasing power every year. They're even worse. Now, if you're an engineer, you think in terms of half-life. The question is, what's the half-life of your money? What's the half-life of your economic energy? When the inflation rate of the dollar is 7%, it means that every 10 years you lose half your wealth. When the inflation rate is 14%, it means every 5 years you lose half your wealth. Gold has an inflation rate of 2%. It turns out the gold miners create 2% more gold every year. That means every 35 years, you lose half your wealth. So the half-life of money in each of those instruments, each of those assets, ranges from a couple of years in a commodity to 10 years in the world reserve currency to 35 years in the dollar. Now, what's the half-life of money in Bitcoin? See, Bitcoin is designed to go asymptotically to 21 million. So, in fact, the inflation rate of Bitcoin over the next 100 years is effectively nothing. Like we've got 19.5 million Bitcoin now, and we'll have 21 million in 100 years. So you're going to get another few percent over the course of 100 years, and then you're going to get nothing more for all of eternity. So if you think about it like that, you realize that the half-life of your money in the right crypto asset in this Bitcoin network is, in essence, infinite, which makes the money immortal.
So there's Michael Saylor. It's evident that his insights are not just rooted in extensive historical study, but also in a deep understanding of current financial trends and technologies. Saylor, a billionaire, engineer, and student of history, has shared a stark warning about the inevitable erosion of wealth due to factors like corruption, taxation, and the creation of monopolies. But more importantly, Saylor has offered us a ray of hope. His unwavering belief in Bitcoin as a revolutionary solution to these age-old problems of financial systems is both inspiring and thought-provoking. He sees Bitcoin as not just an investment, but a means to break the cycle of monopolies, corruption, and indirect taxation through inflation. His prediction of Bitcoin growing 1000x over time reflects his absolute conviction in its potential. Saylor doesn't just theorize, he breaks down practical comparisons of Bitcoin against other asset classes, providing a comprehensive view of why he believes Bitcoin stands superior in preserving and growing wealth. Before you go, I want to remind you that if you found this content valuable and are interested in more financial insights, consider subscribing or liking the video. It's a simple action that supports the channel, ensuring you stay updated with quality financial content. Remember, subscribing is free and you can always change your mind. Anyway guys, hope you all enjoyed today's video and that provided you with some value. I'll see you all in the next one, and as always, all the best.